Okay, I think this is a good time to begin. Welcome everybody to this week's webinar, which is essentially a book launch of Professor Ellen's book, which is called Everyday Communist in South Africa's Liberation Struggle, The Lives of Ivan and Lesley. So I'm gonna read their bios, and then I'm gonna give, I think, Tom 5 minutes, and then.
Oops. No, I'm gonna jump in first. Sorry,
Oh,
I'm gonna go in first, and then Tom.
Yeah. Ellen, I'm gonna give you 5 minutes, and then Tom, I'll give you about 20 minutes, and then after that, I will open up for questions and answer sessions. So let me quickly read the bios. So Ellen is an associate professor and head of the history department at Rhodes University in South Africa. He previously published works on Kalk Bay, fishing communities, and vendor history. Ellen has lectured on African and environmental history since 1985. Much of his teaching has focused on the liberation movement. And then Tom is a professor of peace and conflict studies in the Department of Politics and Public Administration and Dean, Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Limerick. Before arriving in his Melik in 2005, he was professor of political science at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. He also has held positions at the University of York, at the Social Sciences Research Council, and the Electoral Institute of South Africa. Between 1999 and 2000, he was the chair of the Africa Institute of Pretoria. And between 2004 and 2005, he served as on the Research Assessment Executive Evaluation Committee of the National Research Foundations in Pretoria. So I'm gonna hand over to you. Go for it.
Right.
You go first.
Okay. Great, thanks. Sorry, can I just check with Tom? We worked out I'd take longer than you in the beginning, am I right?
Oh, I think
seem
so,
to have
yeah.
got sort of, yeah. But if you feel I should shut up at any stage, please just tell me to shut up. I'm going to stick quite closely to a written text because otherwise I tend to whittle on, and I'm sure you don't want that. I'd just like to start by saying thanks very much to Wit's History Workshop for making it possible for me to launch the book here. I kind of genuinely consider it a great honor to launch it through the workshop. I mean, the workshop is one of the iconic structures of history in South Africa. And to have Tom Lodge here as a discussant is a kind of equal or greater honor. It's if he looks, well, I'm sure he has looked for himself in the footnotes. He appears fairly frequently in the footnotes in the book, and so does Ariana, who I see from the list of participants that I was glancing at before we started. So thanks to both of you for being here, and thanks especially to Tom for being discussant. I must admit I'm kind of in trepidation about what he's going to say, but we'll see what he says. I've tried to look who's signed on. I see there are Schermbruckers here, so I'd very much like to welcome members of the Schermbrucker family. I'm not sure if Lesley is here. I always am quite nervous because she tends to appear incognito. She doesn't have her own internet. So she appears under pseudonyms. I'm sure that it's a kind of secret communist past, but I'm never sure whether she's listening to what I'm saying about her or not. I just work on the assumption that she is, because there was one time I decided she definitely is not here, spoke very freely and got a phone call about 5 minutes after I'd finished the talk and said, I was there, by the way. So it's, yeah.
He says once you assumed you weren't there and then you phoned and said, I was there.
Indeed, so she is there. Yes, welcome, Lesley. Yes. It's very nice to have you here.
He's welcoming you.
Sorry, let me just,
But you can't hear
if
me
it rings
talking
again,
now.
I'll turn it off, sorry. And also thanks, I kind of got carried away and invited just about everybody I know. So friends, family, colleagues, students, whoever's here, thanks very much for coming. Okay, if I could launch into my presentation, as I say, I'll keep it as brief as possible. It lasted about 10 minutes when I tried it out this morning. So I'll try and keep it to that kind of length. I thought I'd start by just sort of contextualizing the book. So having been a student in the second half of the 1970s and having been heavily influenced by Marxist scholarship, I originally come from an academic tradition which is very suspicious of biography. If you had told me then I would end up writing a biography, I would have told you you're mad. I love the words from Walter Rodney, bourgeois subjectivism. And in those days, I would have described biography as bourgeois subjectivism. History is driven not by individuals, but by underlying social and particularly economic forces. I don't think I need to remind anyone here that the driving force of history was always seen as lying in class struggles, and the discipline was seen as a weapon of struggle. At heart, I still kind of sit there. So it's, yeah, so a biography is a strange thing. But during the 1970s and 1980s, I increasingly became influenced by social history methodology, history from below, and particularly microhistory. The detailed life histories of individuals and their environments were seen as being crucial to an understanding of how larger historical processes unfolded. Interestingly, once I began working on this project, I discovered that from the early 2000s, there's been a revival of Communist Party history, particularly in Britain, which to some degree follows a similar trajectory to this. Kevin Morgan has argued that this has empowered authors to move away from grand analyses of the operations and machinations of communist structures and to focus instead on the lives of individual communists. By focusing on the lives of ordinary communists rather than paper cutout heroes of the revolution, or in a South African context, heroes of the struggle, we're beginning to undermine the myth that party cadres were hidebound slaves of party discipline. Instead, to quote Morgan, we have affirmed both the possibility and the validity of approaching the individual communist, in this case, individual communists, as a tangle of relationships and ambitions irreducible to a single line of determinations. In the South African context, a fair amount has been written on the previously hidden history of the Communist Party of South Africa, South African Communist Party, especially since the ending of apartheid. I think all of us remember those dark days when we had to sit in banned book rooms if we wanted to work on anything. And there were all sorts of restrictions about what kind of notes you could take. And I know Rhodes was particularly fascist in enforcing those regulations in those days. Thank God we've moved past those days. So there have been a kind of flood of biographies and autobiographies. How this came about was in 2010, I was sitting in the old jail, which was then backpackers and a pub in Grahamstown's oldest surviving prison building, with a group of students and their friends. I've long had an interest in the party, and Ben Schermbrucker, one of the friends of my students, he never actually was a student of mine, asked me if I'd ever heard of his grandfather. I hadn't, and the conversation which followed led me to thinking that there really was a story to be told here. Not only had Ivan been forgotten about in the party hagiography, but it was his ordinariness. And I'm going to repeat this ordinariness ad nauseam, possibly, coupled with his deep humanitarian commitment to communism and to the party, that begged to be written about. As I began following up on this, I came to realize that Ben's grandmother, Lesley, had played an equally important role. Very much, they were partners in life and in their contribution to the struggle. And through that, I kind of met family members and, kind of snowballing of people to interview and so on. Ivan wasn't one of the public faces of the party. He was known to many in the struggle, and hundreds of shopkeepers and small business people scattered across what was then known as the Transvaal, as the fund collector for the Guardian newspaper, which went through a whole lot of name changes to avoid banning orders and so on, in particular, and to the struggle in general. Many others knew him as the proprietor of Arnold's Christmas Hampers, which is a very strange organization to be funding a revolution, but not realizing that the bulk of the funds which Arnold's collected went into the Guardian and the underground SACP coffers. He was one of the background boys, working tirelessly, apparently with considerable success, and often with little or no recognition, to ensure that in the absence of the mythical Moscow gold, so beloved of the apartheid states of propaganda, the revolution did not run out of funds. And he was remarkably successful in these fundraising activities. Before Ivan's imprisonment, Lesley, the quiet housewife with an exercise business, was secretly supporting Ivan and the party in their work. After his arrest, she moved on to the Central Committee. From the unlikely safe house of the ladies' cloakroom at the upmarket John Orr's department store, she organized the clandestine channeling of party funds and was one of a small group of people organizing Bram Fischer's movements and hiding places during his period on the run as the Scarlet Pimpernel. She was one of the contact persons in and a key part of the group smuggling activists, out of the country. Despite that, it's unlikely that anyone outside a small group surrounding her and Ivan's extremely close friend, comrade, and confidant, Bram Fischer, knew of her activities on behalf of the party. Ivan and Lesley were perhaps unique amongst leftist white activists at the time, in that he was a fluent isiXhosa speaker and she spoke isiZulu. This gave them a bond with African members of the party and the Congress alliance, not shared by many of their contemporaries. They were able to build up relations of trust in situations which their contemporaries found to be more inaccessible. Despite this, they don't easily fit into a rigid struggle hero mold. Both in any cases would have rejected this appellation. Neither Ivan nor Lesley was a theoretician in the Joe Slovo mold. Both did some unique subjects while in prison, but neither had a university education. Both came from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Lesley more so, I argue, than Ivan. Unlike many of their contemporaries, excluding, interestingly enough, Bram Fischer, neither came from any kind of tradition of involvement in the struggle. In common with many of their white activists, many of their fellow white activists, they'd end up owning a house with a tennis court and a swimming pool. Their children would go to private schools, perhaps with more honesty than many of their companions, and I hope that Lesley doesn't mind me outing this quote. Lesley remembers that, and I quote her, "I said to Ivan, and we used to laugh about this, but he didn't say it to anyone else, but from Monday to Friday lunchtime was the revolution. Friday night to Sunday night, you had parties." In an attempt to highlight the fact that struggles are fueled by varying contributions of large numbers of ordinary people whose roles are usually forgotten, the working title of this book was Very Ordinary Communists. As publications grew close, I started to play around with a title that more accurately captured what I was trying to say. In what I considered to be a great play on words, my wife Tessa came up with the title Everyday Communists, which is the final title of the book, demonstrating both their commitment and refining the notion of ordinary. This focus on non-iconic veterans of the struggle is also reflected in short biographical studies in the endnotes to the book and in the names appearing to the index, both of which the publishers were rigid in making me prune dramatically, and much to my chagrin in some cases. I had much more lengthy biographies of, basically, if you were Joe Slovo or Mandela, you didn't get a biography in the footnote because everyone knows who you are. But if you were anyone else, you got a biography in the endnotes. But they in fact made me chop the whole book by more than half, which was a nightmare undertaking. But Paul Malem, who read the original draft, assures me that the final product is much better than the original one. I liked the detail which I cut out in some places, but anyway. So if I can steal from the blurb of the book, which is a way, I put a lot of thought into the blurb, so it's quite nice to steal out of it. In its wider context, the book explores the road of social movements in the South African liberation struggle through the lens of two everyday communists. Ivan and Lesley's contribution to the party was more clandestine than that of leaders such as Bram, Fischer, Joe Slovo, or Walter Sisulu. They represent how ordinary people could play significant roles based on stances more rooted in common decency and morality than in Marxist theory. The book also sheds lights on the interplay between transnational and national tendencies during the liberation movement, particularly during the 1940s and 1960s. The Schermbruckers changed their views in response to the shifting national and international political landscape, the rise of Stalinism, which is, of course, one of those bugbears that keeps rising up in Communist Party history in South Africa, and the flight of South African activists into exile from the 1960s. Examining tensions and conflicts during the liberation struggle, I aim to provide fresh insights into underground activism. That's kind of me. I'll hand over to Tom. I hope I haven't stolen too much of your time, Tom.
Not at all. I should say, first of all, that I really enjoyed Everyday Communists, and I think it's a great title. A better title, I think, than Ordinary Communists would have been, because really, Ivan and Lesley Schermbrucker were not very ordinary, even in the setting of the party itself, which at the time that they joined it had a few thousand members, and that during the time that they belonged to it shrank to a few hundred members. So you had to be fairly extraordinary to belong to it in the first place, to make that kind of choice. It merits saying, of course, that when they joined it, the party was unusually open, because they joined in the 1940s, not in the 30s, not in the 50s. Well, they rejoined it in the 50s, which was a fairly selective procedure. You had to be invited. You couldn't just turn up, because the party by that stage was secret. But when they joined in the 40s, just before the end of the Second World War, the party was fairly open, fairly relaxed. It didn't put people through a kind of rigorous intellectual apprenticeship. You didn't have to do homework and reading and that kind of stuff. You didn't have to prove your sort of theoretical credentials in the way that was the case 10 years beforehand. You didn't have to go to night classes, that kind of thing. I mean, you could if you wanted to, but you didn't have to. And so you could get away with not being that interested in the sort of Leninist canon, or without participating in debates on the dialectic, the kind of thing that Ivan and I think Lesley probably would at that stage found fairly intimidating, or at least boring. The party, as I say, was open, and their reasons for joining were not really to do with the attractions of Marxist theory, but because the party seemed to represent to them a particular kind of decency, because they were people with a fairly unusual background. One of the things that attracted them to the party was the sense in which it conveyed a kind of relaxed social camaraderie between South Africans, between black and white South Africans, and you had to be fairly unusual in a South African setting to find that attractive. And one of the reasons they found it attractive was because they grew up in the countryside, despite coming from fairly socially conservative backgrounds in terms of their parents, in terms of the beliefs of the households that they belonged to. They nevertheless grew up in a setting where black children and white children played together because there was no one else to play with. And so they developed a sense of social empathy, which many South Africans did not have. So in that sense, they were not very ordinary. They were not ordinary for a lot of other reasons as well. But what the book is so strong at doing is at representing and projecting what it was like to be a member of the party in terms of the party's everyday existence. It's also good at projecting what everyday life was like for people who belonged to the party. And Alan's concern as a biographer is to tell us everything about their lives, not just their politics, not just their, if you like, public life, which in any case was a secret public life. And so you can't tell us very much. And so we learn about all kinds of things. We learn about, for example, how they made ends meet, how the family balanced its budget, which was a fairly precarious thing because Ivan Schermbrucker worked for the party unpaid. He was supported by his wife's exercise business. Okay, in the end, they made it. They had a house with a swimming pool, a fairly modest house and a fairly modest swimming pool, I believe. And they managed to send their children to nice schools. By the way, they weren't the first communists to send their kids to Rodin. There were other people that did that as well. And Eddie Roo's wife taught at Rodin during the 1930s. But they had a pretty tough time economically, financially, domestically, but they somehow made ends meet. They somehow kept a family happy and functional. And that was unusual, actually. It wasn't every day in the kind of setting and in the kind of society and the kind of community that they belonged to. One of the first things I did when I was given Alan's book to read was I just finished writing a long book about the Communist Party, and so I checked in my index to see the extent to which I'd actually acknowledged the contribution that Ivan and Lesley Schermbrucker had made. And to my mortification, I found that I'd mentioned Ivan twice, I think. I'm not sure I mentioned Lesley at all. And for that, I think I should feel a certain amount of shame because they were pretty important. They kept things going. The business of providing the party with an income was terribly important. That Christmas hamper business and the subscriptions that kept the Guardian and its successors, New Age, Clarion, and so forth, Spark, operational right through the 1950s, were for the party key sources of lifeblood. Without money, things don't work, as Alan reminds us again and again and again. And Ivan was very good at making money, not for himself, but for other people. And he managed to keep this subscription parcel business going, which had literally thousands of people paying their weekly or monthly installments so that they could get a hamper at Christmas. Founded, in fact, by the trade unionist Arnold Selby, but he took it over after Arnold Selby left South Africa and actually made it run rather more successfully than Arnold Selby had done. And it brought in an income of 60,000 a year and supported about half a dozen workers as well. So its sales were its turnover was considerably larger than that income, and 60,000 pounds, as they were then, in South Africa in the 1950s was a huge amount of money. enough to keep the Guardian operational, enough to fund the party and its small networks, enough to keep things going. He was an absolutely crucial presence. So he wasn't ordinary. The book is about the party's everyday life and its everyday existence and its everyday survival. And I think in the way that he's written it and in the depth of his research, the book represents a really important achievement. And if I ever am lucky enough to produce the second edition of my big history of the party, I'm going to make sure that Ivan and Lesley are mentioned in it a lot more than the twice that I acknowledge their existence in the index. It was an omission for which I, as I say, feel a certain amount of mortification. There are a couple of things that I wanted to know more about, though. Alan makes a strong case for both the Schermbruckers having a particular kind of empathy, and he refers to their ability to make friendships with Black South Africans, and in particular he refers to the friendship with Walter Sisulu. Now, Sisulu is a very difficult person to write about because, unlike many South African political activists, he's left virtually no paper trail. If his letters, they're not in if he wrote any letters, they're not in the public domain. If he wrote any memoirs, I haven't seen them. He's been interviewed quite a lot of times, but he's a modest and self-effacing man. And he doesn't really discuss individuals. One would love to know more about how Ivan influenced Walter Sisulu. Alan thinks that he may have recruited him into the party, and I think that's very likely. But Walter Sisulu never spoke in public or in private, as far as I know, about the reasons that he joined the party or what he actually did within the party. It was a secret, and he was good at keeping secrets. And I think one of the gaps in the research is the absence of Black South African voices that are speaking about Ivan and Lesley. And I think that's a shame, because I'm sure that those friendships were reciprocal friendships. And one would like to know more about how they were perceived and how they interacted with their Black comrades in rather more detail. It's very difficult sometimes to collect anecdotes about warm feelings and friendships, particularly if people are members of a secret clandestine organization where you're almost trained, it's almost a discipline, that you don't speak about individuals, not for the pompous theoretical reasons that Alan was referring to, which explain why Marxists often don't write biographies, or when they do, write rather bad ones, but because it was a matter of survival that you didn't talk about individuals. And so people train themselves not to. So I would like to hear more Black South African voices talking about the Schermbruckers than one listens to in the text of the book. The other theme of the book, which intrigued me, and which I think is worth exploring perhaps in more detail, is the differences that the Schermbruckers had with the exiles, which is a theme that takes up quite a lot of the substance of a couple of the later chapters. They remained, though they were very important in helping other people leave South Africa. One of the things that makes Ivan Schermbrucker particularly important in the history of the party and unusual was that he was actually a very, very talented organizer. He was good at doing practical everyday things. A lot of party icons, a lot of the important people in the party were terrible organizers. Not all of them, but a lot of them. He wasn't. He was a very good organizer. He was very good at practical things. And one of the reasons why so many party people were able to go into exile was because he helped to set up the logistical networks that got them out of the country. But he didn't agree with the party going into exile, or rather, he reckoned it was important. He recognized that it was important that certain people should leave, perhaps because, for one reason or another, they were no longer of any use inside South Africa. But he felt that it was a mistake for the party to give up its existence. And Alan, I don't know whether he does it intentionally or not, but he makes quite a strong case for suggesting that there was a kind of strategic alternative being advocated by Bram Fischer particularly, but those in Fischer's circle, that the party might have been able to exploit certain opportunities and maintain an existence, an independent existence, that would have been rather different to the kind of history that it experienced between the mid-60s and the late 80s, when it had virtually no organized presence inside South Africa. And I think that's an argument that one might want to develop out of the story that Alan's been telling us. But anyway, I thought this was a superb book, and lives well worth living, and lives well spent, and lives that we are enriched in finding out more about. I found this a very moving book. And just to conclude, I mean, it was moving because it's about the private and the personal, not just the political and the public actions of two brave and heroic people. And what Alan's been able to do is to reconstruct the everyday experience of these two people, the way these people lived, their everyday routines, how they paid their bills, how they brought up their children, happily and securely, by the way, the friendships that they made, the friendships that they broke, the friendships that they kept, how they enjoyed themselves. And of course, he also tells us about their love and their confidence in each other, because it's very much a book about a marriage. And so his protagonists may be ordinary enough people, though I'm not sure they are. But in the way that they lived their lives, they became a triumph of the everyday experience.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Tom, for kicking off the discussion with regards to the book. I think at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions, comments. So you can raise your hand. There's a facility to raise your hand. You can also use the chat facility to pose your questions, which I'm happy to read out loud.
Can I, while people are thinking of that, can I maybe just respond to Tom?
Yeah, go for it.
Tom, you put your finger, first of all, thanks very much for a really nice and moving summary of the book. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's the reaction that I was hoping to evoke in people, and that I've managed to evoke it in you is great. Thank you. You put your finger on what for me is the great weakness that I hoped would go away, but needless to say, you put your finger straight on it. I spent a lot of time trying to trace the people, the black people that the Schermbruckers had contacts with, and found them frustratingly elusive. First of all, the time that the book's being written at means that a number of people have passed away, and as the book progressed, even Ivan and Lesley's son Peter passed away. So, people have passed away as the book. I find particularly the Sisulu connection very frustrating. I spent ages trying to chase up what these links. I had these tantalizing glimpses of a close relationship that I could never trace. And I share your frustration with that. I wanted to find more, not only with Sisulu, with other people as well. And I just couldn't. I'm hoping that kind of anybody reading the book I might be able to produce a second edition, but I'm hoping that it will kind of snowball, and I will discover the people I've been looking for that haven't passed away, or the families of those who may have recollections. But yeah, I agree that it's it's an absence in the text. The differences with the exiles, I found fascinating. I mean, I didn't want to write about them because one, despite what the party has become, one still has some kind of loyalty to the party. You know, it's kind of a shadow of its former self, but one still feels some kind of loyalty. But I felt it was important to highlight those differences and the fact that they were deeper than we tend to like to gloss over. By the way, I see Leslie's hand is up, but sorry,
Yeah.
I'll leave that up to Kelly.
No,
and I think Lisa is typing things as we speak.
Yeah, so Lisa says that she would like you to reflect a little bit on the photographs that are included in the book and the cover as well. And then I guess, Lesley, please go for it, and Ellen can answer both.
Lesley, you'll need to unmute yourself if you... There's a bottom left hand of your screen, there's a thing that says mute. You need to click on that and it'll unmute you.
Trying to do that.
Yeah, there we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Talk. Hello, Ellen. Hello, Tom Lodge. Thank you so much for setting up this launch. It's really given me a very, really nice feeling. And all I can say is thank you, Ellen, for writing the book, and that I'm allowed to see it, and I'm allowed to read it. You've given the book a terrific launch. Thank you very, very much indeed. Enough.
If I can comment.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for listening.
Right,
Should I respond to those two first, or should I wait for Ariana as well?
Yeah, do you mind if I take Ariana and then we just
yeah, sure.
Then I'll take another round. Ariana, please go ahead.
Hi, Tom, and hi, Alan. I wanted to ask you about how the politics, how the communism shaped everyday life in the sense of their private lives, both in the sense of their relationship as a husband and wife, and in raising a family. How did that? Yeah, I wanted to know how that influenced their private life. And going back to, to the idea of everyday communists rather than ordinary, whether there was anything extraordinary in all of that, in the ordinariness of their lives.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Should I respond to those, and then we can see? Yeah. First of all,
yes.
if I can respond to Lesley. Thank goodness you're still alive, Lesley. May you live to be 100 as well. I was a bit worried as the book, I started this book in, I think I said 2010, and I was getting a bit worried. Lesley wasn't getting any younger. And I kind of thought, I said to her on occasion, just hang in there till the book is out. Now that the book's out, please don't take that as an opportunity to depart either. Hang around still. But I'm very glad that you managed to read it. I'm very sorry that Peter didn't manage to read it, because he played a major role in my writing of the book. So, yeah. Okay, if I can take them then. Yeah, if I pick up on Lisa first, yeah. Lisa, thank you to you and Carla for making the photographs possible. What happened was I had a sort of heated negotiation with the publishers. They always try to cut costs. I think authors have this thing. Well, I would like the book to be cheaper than it is, let me say, but authors want to put everything in, and I found through the family had all these wonderful photographs, and I kind of negotiated with the publishers. Well, I want to have 50 photographs, and they said, well, you can't. And we kind of we kind of settled eventually that they put the photographs in text rather than in a kind of bloops in the middle of the book. I like the fact that they put them in text, although I discovered to my horror that increases the price of the book as well. But I think it's much nicer having photographs related to the text. And basically what happened was I got access to a lot of photographs from the family. Any of you who've published recently know that permissions for photographs are a nightmare. It was fairly easy with permissions for the family because Lesley, through Jill, gave permission for me to use family archive photographs. But some of the other photographs I ended up not being able to get permission for. For instance, I wanted to put in, not because I have any great love of him, but I wanted to put a photograph of the infamous interrogator Roy Swanepoel in. I don't want to say anything defamatory. I don't feel like being sued after, but he's not my favorite character in the book. And I thought it might be, but I couldn't get permission to use an image of, in fact, I couldn't trace who owns the copyright to the original photograph. The only photograph that I have of him, being a security policeman, he was equally hesitant to be photographed as the communists were at the time. So there were images that I just couldn't get permission for. If I'm talking about permissions, can I just say that there's a lengthy poem by Hugh Lewin in the book, which I feel perfectly captures the experience of being incarcerated. And I very much thank his estate for permission. They gave me no hassles at all. They just said, please put it in. Yeah. But permissions are a nightmare to chase up. But I got these photographs and then I thought, well, now what do I do with them? And I went to Lisa, who's in that rare position of being an historian, but also, you know, is in the fine arts department at University of Johannesburg. And she brought in Carla Crawford, and between them, they produced the wonderful images. I mean, if I can hold up the book, I think the cover image is incredible. It's which is from the Schermbruckers. Most of the photographs are from the Schermbrucker archives, and they did wonders with the photographs. So I would have loved there to have been. I think there's about 20. I can check, but there's about 15, 20 photographs in the final. I would have loved there to have been, as I say, 50, but the publishers weren't going there, and the book would have been even more unaffordable. Then, if I can pick up on Ariana as well, yeah, you know, what I find, and I think it's, you know, something that we all know, but I think the Schermbruckers exemplify this, is that, and Tom picked up on some of this in his commentary on the book. Sorry, I've now lost my train of thought because I read a comment from Lisa at the bottom of the page. Let me just try and pick up my train of thought again. Is that, you know, the Schermbruckers were not great theoreticians about communism. Communism for them was a daily way of living that impacted all aspects of their lives. And I think in common with many other activists at the time, you know, the party provided the only viable alternative to fascism. I love that. I still overuse that word, but my students and colleagues will tell you that it's one of my favorite words. Okay, but you know, it was the only viable alternative to supporting the system. It held up some, because the party during the period, I mean, we all shamedly know those old slogans from the 1922 miners' strike about the Communist Party. But the Communist Party became the only really non-racial political formation in the country, or anti-racist political formation in the country. And I think communism held out you kind of didn't have a choice. If you wanted to oppose the system and create a new system, and there's quite a lot in the book about Lesley talking, and there's still quite a lot left. I'm afraid I had to cut quite a lot of that out as well. Just that this kind of presented a way of life that to them made sense, and to many other activists at the time. This is what we want South Africa to look like. The party was the only organization that held out that promise. And communism, you know, if there was an alternative, maybe they would have chosen the alternative, but there was no alternative. They were deeply committed to this idea of a just, fair society where everybody was equal, everybody had equal opportunities, and you know, they both became very disillusioned with Stalinism. You know, Stalinism is one of those, as I've said already, bugbears in the history. If you want to shut an old commie down like a clam under 1,000 meters of sea, just bring up Stalin and they tend to shut up. You know? So it's one of those kind of ghosts in the background of the party. So they didn't uncritically accept the party, particularly as time went on. I mean, I go back to that idea of tensions between exiles, between stayers and leavers. And I think Tom picked up as well, I know Tom picked up on the fact that there was an alternative which wasn't realized. You know, I think if we're going to look tactically, it was a mistake for the party to go in the direction it did. There should have been a focus on building up an internal structure during those periods when the focus was on exile. And I think it could have been achieved, but, you know, the party was well and truly blown. I mean, in the book, I've got sort of documents exposed where all the kind of secret strategies were produced at the trial. By the way, the chapter on the trial was originally, I've forgotten now, but I think it was 313 pages long originally, and got shortened down to about 40 pages. The trial fascinated me, and there's only one copy of the record left, which strangely enough is in the Corey Library at Rhodes. I went all over the place trying to track down this trial record, and eventually found it in my own backyard. In terrible microfilm, which spoiled my eyes even more than, yeah. But so, you know, it very much, and also if you look at who were your friends, the Schermbruckers had many friends who weren't communists, but the core of their friendships were people who were either communists or tied up with the parties or fellow travelers or whatever we want to call them. You know, if you're an activist, you don't have many choices about who you make friends with because you're worried about exposing yourself. You need people that have the same shared secrets as you. You can't kind of freely discuss with your friends as you could overseas, you know, have these free political discussions. So, you know, it definitely, it shaped and you know, what's interesting is if you look at the children, neither Peter, on some degree, sometimes would say to me, at heart, he feels he's a socialist. So, you know, there's some, but the whole family became disillusioned. Let's say Lesley and Jill and Peter became disillusioned with communism because of the way that the struggle unfolded. And as they said, some of the people involved were not very nice people. So I think they felt in some ways that the revolution had been betrayed by the quality of the cadres that were, in some cases. So yeah, it definitely permeated all aspects of their life. I hope that I answered you, Ariana.
All right, so we have two questions. Mark Stein says, enjoyed the lecture. Within the extended family, were Ivan and Lesley's politics different from any other family members? And then we have a question from Moabi, says, thanks, Professor Tom. for his remarks. I would like to know if there are any relations that Ivan and Lesley had established with other Africans on the African continent, and what was the nature of such relations, and to what extent, if any, did such relations influence or impact on the SACP, the previously known as...
Let me say a little bit about both and then hand back to Alan.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah.
One of the things that was interesting was that neither of these two people came from families in which there was a kind of dynastic commitment to the left. Ivan did actually come from a family that was quite distinguished politically. One of the original settler families in the 19th century, a great-grandfather who was quite eminent in terms of being a public personality, an MP and so forth.
Dex, we've got like about 20 minutes left, okay? Yeah.
Okay. You know, the families were very different. They were, I think, without being disparaging about them, they would have been socially conservative. On the other hand, they were very supportive. There's a lovely anecdote which Alan has. At one stage, I think it's Ivan who's in prison, and his brother comes to visit him in prison. His brother is wearing a policeman's uniform because his brother was a serving member of the South African police. He came to visit his brother because Ivan was his brother. I mean, family loyalties overrode everything else. In other words, families could be supportive without necessarily feeling any sense of political empathy or comradeship. And I think that's fairly important. It's also important in another way because it tells us something about the way that they conducted their own family. They didn't force feed their children with party. Their children had normal, in terms of normal middle-class white South African lives, it would seem. Though they socialized, of course, fully as party members with other people who were friends. They didn't, these weren't, to use the description that Barbara Hamel once employed, these weren't diaper communists, as it were, children who were brought up to be party members from the time that they were in nappies. I think they were the kinds of parents who would have allowed their children space to make up their own minds and their own decisions. On the Schermbruckers and other parts of Africa, they didn't travel, which again makes them unusual. They didn't get any of the sort of freebies, you know, free trips to the German Democratic Republic or whatever other joyful experiences were available to party members in the 1950s. Perhaps they were offered them, but they never took them up. They weren't particularly interested in travel of that particular kind. And they didn't go into exile. The party, in fact, I think the implication of the question was, did Africans join the party more generally? Yes, they did. The party by the 1950s was predominantly Black South African, led mainly by Black South Africans. It was a highly selective organization. It didn't go in for mass recruitment. The only time that it actually really opened up its membership, apart from after 1990, was in the 1940s. And then too, it was a predominantly Black South African organization. The party didn't enjoy an easy ride when it went into exile in other African settings. It encountered a great deal of hostility and suspicion from African nationalist politicians across the continent. And the ANC often had to sort of be fairly discreet about its connections with the Communist Party and about people within its own ranks and leadership who were communists. There were communist parties elsewhere in Africa. In Sudan, for example, the party had a very close relationship with the Communist Party of the Sudan, which was an important and influential organization for quite a long time. And there was, of course, a communist party in Lesotho, which, and indeed membership between the South African party and the Lesotho party it was a kind of cross-membership situation. But on the whole, the party's existence in the rest of Africa was a fairly uncomfortable affair until the Angolans and the Mozambicans began governing their own countries. And then the party there could function with rather more openness and in a rather more self-possessed way than was the case elsewhere.
Thanks, Tom. You've actually covered all the main points there, and in fact, in some cases in more detail than I could have. So thank you. Yes, I think picking up on some of those, yeah, what always struck me, and I sometimes find it difficult to remember which version is the final published version, because I say more than half of it got cut out. So I know that there was in the original version, I think it still comes through, quite a lot of stuff on how the rest of the family, and they're both, you know, Lesley in particular came from a large family. The rest of their family kind of thought they were mad. Certainly were politically conservative, but kind of they were family, and you know, you support family, and in fact, you know, at one stage both parents were in prison. You know, the family were very supportive of the children. Didn't stay. There's a whole section in the book on, you know, the children under this, because the children had both parents in prison. Jill was kind of just finished school. Ivan was still at school, and Peter was still at school, and they were deprived of parents. And I was all in the interviews, you know, very suitably sort of support. Oh dear, this must have been terrible for you. And Peter's response was, what teenage boy doesn't want his parents to disappear? He wasn't being flippant and dismissing his parents, but you know, there was a network. The family kind of was a supportive network for Ivan and Lesley. The children did have a hard time during the time when their parents were in prison, but kind of they had a strength which I think came from the way they were brought up very independently, and given a lot of freedom. And you know, Peter, I think this is in the final, Peter sort of talks about how much his dad's communism was part of everyday life, and that, you know, he was very into camping, he was very into fishing. Ivan was also very into fishing, also very into music. He was into motorbikes. He did all of these things. But at the, you know, and Ivan would support him in all these things, and Lesley would support him. Then he'd say, but you know, you knew that you would go and help somebody in distress as well. So you'd kind of have music, and then you'd pop in at somebody and see if they needed help, or so there was this kind of mixture of, family and of kind of communism and of just really enjoying life. You know, they really, I have a whole lot of prison correspondence, which was meant to form part of the book originally, but just got cut out but during the time that Ivan was on trial, I have all of the letters that Lesley wrote to him. And this is going to be a separate, the trouble is it's more than an article. It could be a separate book, because she talks about what movies she's gone to see. She talks about what plays she's gone to see. They've gone to see a mime. They've gone to hear music. They've gone to do, and there's this fascinating life of, you know, they've been to this restaurant. They've eaten this. There's this fascinating kind of picture into middle-class stroke activist, stroke white South African, stroke struggle life at the time. That obviously she couldn't write about the struggle in letters that were going to prison. But there's fascinating insights into, and also into other people, other people who were either, as I've said before, sort of fellow travelers or hangers-on or whatever, or communists themselves. So both were very careful throughout not to implicate other people. So for instance, even during the trial, Ivan would speak freely about people who were already in exile. Lesley went to jail for refusing to testify against Bram Fischer. They were highly principled on what they revealed. Lesley could have escaped a lot of time in solitary confinement if she had blabbed about Bram Fischer, which she just refused to do. So 300 days, who would take 300 days of solitary confinement to not give any evidence about Bram Fischer? It's, by the way, it was also as a sort of, I love totally irrelevant sidelines. I'm sure everyone's heard of Daisy de Melker, the poisoner. Lesley was actually housed in Daisy de Melker's cell when she was in solitary. So yeah. But I think Tom picked up on the points that I would have picked up on there.
All right. Thanks for that. Really fascinating. I think we have a couple of more minutes to take more questions, but I don't see any. I'll just read a comment from Mike. He says Evan's brother Bram was great with animals and ended up in police mounted unit looking after the horses, as I recall from Evan's late sister Agnes. I don't see any other hands.
Let me not scratch. Oh, well, can you see? There's a picture of Bram on horseback. Oops.
Oh, we can't see properly. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I don't see any more hands. I don't know if, Tom, you have maybe concluded.
Well, let me just say, just encourage those of you who haven't read the book to do so. And the footnotes, by the way, that Alan mentions, I mean, he had to cut out half of them, but the rest of them are still there, and they are superb. You are, in effect, really getting two books for the price of one, which is just as well, because the book is horribly expensive, but you can get a discount, which I'm sure Kirkaldy will tell you about. But it's really worthwhile, because as well as the biography, this paired biography of these two really very, very compelling personalities, attractive in every way. You get a veritable who's who of the South African left, and each footnote, each potted biography, I think there are about 60 of them, I counted, is itself a work of really compendious research. So it's a really good buy, the book, and I encourage you to, if you can't afford it, get your library to order it. It's the kind of text that should be available very widely amongst South African historians.
I probably shouldn't say this. I'm sure there's contract, but if your university library or your library buys it, you effectively have the book for free, because the ebook is a PDF. So I didn't say that, but yeah.
Okay,
I know Rhodes is, but I managed to persuade Rhodes. I felt a bit bad. I persuaded them to buy the hardcover and the e-version. But yeah, it means that people, if your library has the e-version. I'm afraid at the moment there's no plans to bring it out in South Africa. Palgrave don't say, Tom, you may know more than me about this, but they don't seem very keen on kind of publishing agreements with other publishing houses. Have I been talking to the wrong people, or?
No, I think you're right. Look, they've done it. In all fairness, they've done an absolutely fabulous job. They were much more accepting of your scholarly apparatus than many publishers would be nowadays. And notwithstanding the restrictions that you encountered, their treatment of the photographs was very generous. It's a beautifully produced book. I think they've done you and the Schermbruckers proud. In other places, of course, it wouldn't be such an expensive book, just in South Africa.
Yeah,
Okay,
can I say, yes, I didn't want to sound like I was knocking the publishers. They have been incredibly supportive and helpful and given me kind of free rein, except for the fact that they made me cut so much out. But Paul Malem told me that I needed to cut it out. It was verbose. So, yeah. I see Lynn.
I'm gonna squeeze in, if it's fine, I'm gonna squeeze in Lynn and then conclude the webinar. Go for it.
Hi. Sorry, I can't see where to put in a question.
No, go for it, Lynn. You can go ahead.
Oops, you need to unmute yourself again.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Alan, what a brilliant project, but was it difficult for you to find a publisher?
It was surprisingly easy, actually. In fact, they were the first publisher I approached and they accepted it. So thank you to them. I mean, yes, I didn't have to shop around. I tried to, I kind of asked around, I asked friends and colleagues, you know, who would you publish? And this studies in the history of social movements seemed a perfect place to publish it. And I kind of pitched it to them and they accepted it. So there wasn't much running around. Yeah.
Sorry, one more time. Is this an academic publisher?
Yes, it is. Yes, yeah.
Oh, that's what makes it a bit easier.
Yeah. I do like to hope that the book is readable. I try to, the academic publishers are very wary of books pitched at a general market as well. They kind of warn you again. But I like to hope that anyone can pick up this book and read it. If I can thump my ideological tub, I believe that academic salaries are funded by taxpayers. And that the public have a right to be able to read their academic production, that it should be accessible. So I like to hope that kind of anyone can pick up the book and enjoy it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Ellen, and thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody, for joining in and making the time. That brings the end of this book launch. I forgot to mention at the beginning that this session is recorded and a copy will be uploaded on the Vets History Workshop YouTube page for those that were not able to join the live one. And that brings us to the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I just say thanks to you and to particularly to Tom as well. Thanks for your generous comments, Tom. Yeah, and thanks, Wits, for all the help you've given me with setting this up. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Alan. Thanks.
Bye.
Tom,
Thank
for
you. It's nice seeing
participating.
you again. Yes.
Nice to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Alan. It was great.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yes. Yeah. Stay well, everyone. Yeah.
Stay well.